Jesus was very busy teaching. Luke tells us that people had gathered in their thousands and were even trampling on each other in their eagerness to hear him speak and learn. Just before our story, Jesus had talked to his friends and encouraged them to be brave and confess him, even in front of hostile people. And at this point, he is interrupted and asked by someone to settle a family dispute. "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." But Jesus refuses and instead teaches everyone about the meaning of possessions and warns them about two things. Be on your guard against all kinds of evil and greed, all kinds of greed. And secondly, life is more than an abundance of possessions. When unchurched and non-believing people think of religion, and particularly the Christian religion maybe, they think that we ask people to begin a dour life, moralistic, unhappy, and constrictive. Many will vaguely remember that Christians are told, "Thou shalt not," although generally many people are looking for the security and guidance of instructions like the Ten Commandments. But they are right in that there is a great danger in using religion to produce moral code books and catalogues for behavior of life, because life is far too complex to fit into short sets of rules. As a result, religion has become and can become narrow, self-promoting, even masquerading as faithfulness when it actually serves the power of those who use it. After Jesus tells his friends to confess him as Lord without fear, he allows himself to be interrupted by someone who is stuck in the daily grind of business and family life. He has to manage his property. Neither is inherently bad, but a gift from God to help with our living. But the question is indeed how we live. How do we shape our relationships, shape our families, and how do we use our property in the process? And the answer will reveal much about what we really believe in. In refusing to judge the inheritance dispute, Jesus refuses to use faith as a whipping tool. Instead, he implicitly asks people to use their own judgment, their reflection, their imagination, based on their faith, to do it themselves, minding his advice and support. And as so often, Jesus teaches by telling a story and giving us the two warnings. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed, and life is more than an abundance of possessions. And as a result, Jesus speaks right into our time and into our situations, where we live in a time of an extraordinary culture of consumerism. Consumerism drives us on and on to want more and more. And what is worse, once we have it, we want something else. We are encouraged to go shopping until we drop. Words like profit, expansion, and growth are the buzzwords of the markets. And we are overtly and subliminally directed to shop until we drop, judged by the clothes we wear, the cars we drive, the amount of money we earn, while many in the world go without. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Do we even notice that money, the greed for this or that, or yet something else, holds us in its clutches? Do we notice that we are trained by forces we have no control over to permanently want something else, to be permanently dissatisfied? Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. The letter of the Colossians goes as far as calling greed idolatry. Not God and His will are at the center of our motivations, but something else has taken over. And Jesus is recorded to say in Matthew's Gospel, "Do not store up for yourselves treasure on earth, but store up for yourselves treasure in heaven. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." Jesus tells us to love God with all our hearts and minds and strength, not only on a Sunday or when we have a spiritual notion, but all the time. All our living, money and all, is to serve God. God our Father, Jesus our Lord, the Spirit of reconciliation and peace. That is the way to heaven, not money. That is the way to happiness, not any kind of possession. Life is much more than our compulsion to amass possessions. Life is God's greatest gift to all of us, not as a burden, but as a parent gives a gift to a beloved child. We heard today the most beautiful chapter in the book of Hosea. We sometimes remember the prophets in the Old Testament as very gruff people, telling of doom and gloom for the people of Israel. Hosea particularly keeps being very negative and has to tell, this is because he has to tell of God's agony in watching his children ruining themselves by turning away from God and cutting themselves off from his good and caring will. Hosea uses the images of a spurned spouse, which we heard last week, and a rejected parent, which is in the reading today, to tell Israel how God feels. Will God judge them? Yes. Can God call evil good? No, of course not. But will God ultimately destroy them? No. Hosea tells us that God is not like that, not behaving like a human being. I will not execute my fierce anger. I will not again destroy Ephraim. For I am God and no mortal, the Holy One in your midst, and I will not come in wrath. Instead, God will bring his children home. Grace will win. That is what God is like. He sent his only Son, Jesus our Lord, to help and guide us home to him. So what are we to do with our wealth? How much is enough for us to live on? What are we to do with our inheritance, income, profit? Every one of us will have to think it through for themselves, with their nearest and dearest. There are no hard and fast rules. But God does want us to have a conversation with him about it. Remembering, be on your guard against all kinds of greed, and life is more than an abundance of possessions. So use what has been entrusted to you responsibly, responding to the life around you. Remember that life is much more than sitting like the cartoon character Uncle Dagobert Duck, which I remember for some reason sitting on piles of money. Note that Jesus in his story of the rich fool does not castigate an abundant harvest, but does criticize, or rather even doesn't even do that. He questions what he does with his wealth and his windfall. Ironically, God interrupts his plans and asks, "What will happen with your abundance now?" Some of you may have heard of the L'Arche community, a community of able-bodied people living together with people with disabilities, learning disabilities or physical disabilities. And it was founded by somebody called Jean Vanier. And he wrote this: "Communities which live simply and without waste, and which do not use television all the time, help people to discover a whole new way of life, which demands fewer financial resources, but more commitment to relationships and to celebration. Is there a better way to bridge the gulf which widens daily between rich and poor countries? It is not simply a question of generous people going to work in developing countries. Rich countries themselves have to be awakened to the fact that happiness is not to be found in a frantic search for material goods, but in simple, loving relationships, lived and celebrated in communities which have renounced that search." So may we not be like the rich fool, neither complacent with it, nor envious or resentful, worshipping money and possessions. Instead, may God liberate us to serve him joyfully with our talents and all other gifts entrusted to us. Amen.